Welcome to Premise Podcast. This is your host, Angelos Sophocleous. In this episode, I host Professor Constantine Sandis, a professor of philosophy at the University of Hertfordshire. We discuss how people are motivated to act, what might be their reasons for acting, and we make an important distinction between things people do and people's doing of those things. Further, we examine whether there are any necessary actions in the world, what is the place of moral responsibility in Professor Sandis' work, and what artificial intelligence in animals can tell us about human action. Welcome everyone to this episode of Premise Podcast. Today with me I have Professor Constantine Sandis, who is a professor of philosophy at the University of Hertfordshire. He has written numerous books on the philosophy of action, which we're going to discuss today, and on Ludwig Wittgenstein, whose philosophy we're going to analyze. Professor Sandis is the secretary of the British Wittgenstein Society and editor of Anthem Studies in Wittgenstein and Philosophers in Depth. He also hosts Bloomsbury's Why Philosophy Matters series of events and has collaborated with Microsoft Research on designing intelligible AI. Professor Sandis, welcome to Premise Podcast.
Thanks very much. Thank you.
So, we're going to divide this discussion in discussing the philosophy of action and discussion on Ludwig Wittgenstein, which are two things you specialize on. To begin with, you have written numerous books on the philosophy of action, and I would like to discuss the ideas you propose in these books, in your book, The Things We Do and Why We Do Them, in which you provide a philosophy of action, examining how we are motivated to do things, if that's through beliefs, desire, facts, what are our reasons for action, different kinds of belief to faith, belief to moral statements. Would you like to expand on what the aim of that book is?
So when I began writing the book, I was reading a lot of stuff on debates about the nature of reasons for action. And there would be, on the one hand, people who would argue that reasons are what they would call mental states, so beliefs and desires, in the sense in which these are mental phenomena of some kind. And on the other hand, people who argued that reasons were maybe what we might call external to the mind, so maybe facts or states of affairs or propositions or something that seemed sort of very non-mental. So I was interested in kind of how this debate got going and why it wasn't becoming resolved. And I have some views on this. But also, another thing that struck me before we go into the details was how a lot of this literature on reasons for action didn't say much at all about, on the one hand, what actions were. So there wasn't much of a philosophy of action. And on the other hand, there wasn't much theory of explanation, so how explanations work. So I thought there was a kind of really bizarre situation where there are people arguing about the ontology of reasons without really saying much about either explanation or action. And I think why this was the case was that if you want to win as many sort of people over to your point of view, it's good to remain neutral on as many debates as possible. So I think somewhere in the background was the thought, you can just plug in your favorite account of action and this will work, or maybe also with explanation, whatever the details of explanations are, whatever theory of explanation you subscribe to, this ought to work. And on occasion, you would have people who, once they had defended their account of reasons, would say something about what view of explanation that best fit. But this came kind of very late in the day. And so I was really struck by this. And I also think it doesn't work. So I spent a lot of time in that first book, The Things We Do and Why We Do Them, looking at different, what I call different concepts and conceptions of action, a distinction we can come back to in a moment, and how, depending on how one is thinking about action, this will affect how we think about both explanations and reasons for action. So one of the things the book tries to do is lay out all these different concepts and conceptions of action, and then look at whether there are different concepts and conceptions of reasons for action. And what we end up with is a kind of conceptual pluralism where there are different things we might be interested in that fall under the banner action explanation. And depending which one we're interested in, certain accounts of reasons will make more sense than others. I can keep going, but I thought I'd stop and ask you if that makes sense.
That makes perfect sense. I think it relates to the distinction you make between the things people do and people's doing the things. As you said in the beginning, most philosophy of action focused on the things people do than people's doing the things.
Yes, so this was a distinction I first came across in a slightly different form in the work of Jennifer Hornsby. It's there in her first book, Actions, and she elaborates on it more in later work like Simple Mindedness, where she does apply it a little bit to action explanation in one of the papers there. I've since then I found an earlier version of it in John McMurray, slightly different from both Hornsby's and mine. Also, you get versions of it in Paul Ricoeur, for example. And so there are different ways of capturing this distinction, and this has become increasingly important for me. But it's true that to begin with, there's the thought that there's what I do and my doing of it. These seem like two different things, and depending on what you think each of these are, it may affect how reasons relating to each of these are going to be. I think in every day, we tend to focus on why we do things. I think philosophers are equally interested in explaining why what they think of as the events of our doing these things occur. But the trouble is that a lot of philosophers, even though they have that somehow in their sights, if they haven't made the distinction and they conflate these two things, then we'll have a debate about reasons why we do things, but they're looking for something that can play the role of explaining why an event occurred. And that's where the trouble starts for me. And in fact, I've recently finished a paper called Are Reasons Like Shampoo, where the thought is that you can have sort of 2-in-1 or 3-in-1 shampoos. And I think people want 2 or 3 different kinds of things from reasons. They want them to be able to explain why actions occur. They want them to be things that we act in the light of, and they want them to motivate us. And I think these are 3 distinct functions, and no one thing can play all 3 of them. So in a way, there is no, the search for this kind of holy grail of a reason that can do these 3 things is just a bad thing to be engaged in. And if you're looking for reasons why events occur, you shouldn't think that whatever those things are might also be the things that motivate us to act, and in turn, the reasons or considerations we act in the light of. So this gives you a sense of the kind of pluralism.
It seems we are a bit uncomfortable not knowing the reason something happened, and we're too quick in pinpointing to a reason in the chain of events that led to another event. As I understand your arguments, you argue when we're trying to find the reason something happened in the causal chain, we pinpoint to one thing in the causal chain, but there are, of course, other things in the causal chain which led to an event. For example, we might say that I'm driving and I run a red light and then there is a car accident. And I might say the reason I had the car accident was because I ran a red light. But of course, I wouldn't have run a red light if I had left my home like 5 seconds earlier. And the reason I didn't leave my home 5 seconds earlier was because I wanted to check if I locked the door. So the fact that I wanted to check if the door is locked is part of this series of this chain of events, which if I didn't have to check that the door is locked, the accident wouldn't have happened. So is this something you're saying, that there is this chain of events that is difficult to pinpoint to one event and establish that as the cause of an event taking place?
Sort of. I think that there were a few different things in what you said, and most of what I'm interested in isn't really to do with causes of events, though I do have some interest in this. So let me try and maybe unpick a bit of what you said, and then you can tell me if I've understood you correctly. So one thing that I definitely think is true is that when we have a particular action, even if we specify a particular description of this action, there's no such thing as explaining the action. Explanations are really answers to questions about action. And so you might have one and the same action, and you might have different questions about it. To give a very sort of simple example, if you ask a bank robber, why do you rob banks? The famous joke is because that's where the money is. And that's in a way understanding the question as why are banks the things you rob, rather than why do you rob banks. So we have a kind of an action and different things we might ask about it. We might be more interested in the fact that it's an instance of robbery, or we might be interested in the fact that it's robbing a bank or a particular bank. And so whatever may be true in the causal chain leading up to the event of the bank robbing, we may just have many different questions about the action. And so there's no such thing as the objective explanation of an action on my picture. Rather, there are different answers to different questions. That doesn't mean that anything goes, that these are the right answers. But the point is that there are, I mean, we can give right and wrong answers, but the point is that there's an innumerable number of questions we can ask about any specific action. And depending what we're interested in, a different factor will be the relevant one that does the explanation. Must these factors be part of a causal chain? Well, only if what we're explaining is the event of someone's acting and we're trying to figure out why that event occurred. But if you're trying to, if what you want to know is how I was reasoning and what kind of things I took to be good reasons for acting, then the things that we'll pick out will only be indirectly, I think, related to causal chains. Does that? I'm not sure how close this is to what you were saying.
Yes, the statement that there is no objective causal factor of an event taking place.
I mean, there will be different causal factors, and I mean, this is an old point that many people have made, that there's no such thing as the cause of anything. It will depend on what it is about the event's occurrence that you're trying to figure out. There's a nice bit in Donald Davidson's work where he talks about causal explanations being intentional as with an S, so contrasting with extensional. And the example, this is kind of paraphrasing a bit, but the example is someone has a rash, and the cause of the rash is that they rubbed themselves, they dried themselves with a towel that was coarse. And the towel that was coarse was the pink towel in the corner. So in a way, it's true that why does this person have a rash? Because they dried themselves with the pink towel. But while that's true, it doesn't explain anything for us if we don't know that that towel was coarse. So the description that's relevant for us is the one that brings out the coarseness of the towel rather than, say, the color of the towel or the fact that it was a towel they bought in a certain shop however many years ago. So again, that kind of brings out that you can make true statements about something, but you need a redescription to bring out the explanation.
Going back to the discussion about your book specifically and the distinction you make between the things people do and people's doing of those things, and you also talk about perceiving and the act of perceiving, or painting and the act of painting. And you also give specific examples, such as in obituaries, where if you read an obituary, you have a list of the things, good or bad things that person has done, but you don't see the motives behind that person's acting. So why is it important to make this distinction between the actions and the motives behind the action?
Yes, thanks. I'm glad you brought the obituary thing up. I'd forgotten about it. So the thought there was that if we're interested in someone's achievements, for example, it's very easy very easy. We can begin listing things they did that were, particular achievements. And when we try and capture a life, whether it's in some kind of when you're giving some kind of life award to someone, or whether it's an obituary, it comes very natural to list things people did, and not just successes, maybe also attempts that end up failing, or maybe just general facts about their life, where they went to school, if they got married, where they lived. So these are all kind of things they did. And as I understand things done in this sense, there are things that in principle someone else can do. So two people can in principle both travel to the same place, maybe even on the same train at the same time. And so a thing done, while it may be the thing that I did or that you did, the way we conceive of these things are as things that are ultimately separable from us. And our doings of these things, by contrast, are completely tied with our intentions, our motives, our reasons for action, and the particularity of my traveling to Paris versus your traveling to Paris, and so on. And while we may try and capture some of this in something like an obituary, by and large, this is left out. And so you don't really get a sense of the, for lack of a better term, inner life of a person, for one. Of course, an obituary may talk about someone's beliefs in relation to the things they do. But what you don't get is, unless it's a particularly striking obituary that keeps mentioning reasons all the time, you won't really know what was going on when a person did X, Y, and Z. And we know that two people can do the same thing for strikingly different reasons and with strikingly different motives. And this can give rise to completely different lives. So to give an example, you and I might both contribute to the same charity, and we might give the same amount or the same percentage of our income, or however you want to put it. And so someone could write about what we did and say, Angelos and Constantine both gave X amount to this charity. But now suppose that your giving to this charity is your attempting to help children in need, and my giving to this charity is my showing off in front of some friends or something like that. That's very hard to capture in the list of things done. Of course, we can say what Constantine did was show off, but it's very hard to capture that with the language of he gave X amount to charity. So this is the kind of stuff that gets left out. And yet, if you look at what kind of life a person had, if we think of, indeed, if in Nietzschean terms you want to think of the person as the totality of their actions or something like that. It's important that this isn't just things done, but what we really have in mind is the doings of these things that aren't separable from motive and intention.
Mm-hmm. Because otherwise, if we just focus on the action, it seems that we regard action as just mimicking behavior. It's just, for example, when you give to charity, you're just mimicking the action of giving to charity without taking the reasons into much consideration.
Yes, I guess so. So, in people who talk about these things in the context of virtue ethics will talk about vicious people who sort of mimic the actions of the virtuous person. And Rosalind Hursthouse, for example, says that in one sense they do the same thing, and in another sense they do something quite different. I prefer to talk in terms of there's one thing they do that's the same, namely give to charity, but they each also do something quite different. So one of us shows off and the other doesn't, for example. And it's important, I think, at this point to realize that by and large, when people talk of the same action having many descriptions, they tend to switch to the language of doing. And it's very hard to think of things done as having redescriptions that bring out motives, for example, or reasons. And that's precisely because two people can do the very same thing from very different motives and for different reasons. Intention is, as Anscombe had noticed, is a little bit different. So certainly some descriptions of what we do can reveal intention up to a point. So if you redescribe a killing as a murder or a telling an untruth as a lying, then the intention is built in the redescription murder, lying. But that's because murder is a subset of killing and lying is a subset of telling an untruth. So you can look at things done and think of some things done as falling under types of other things done. But giving to charity and showing off, well, showing off isn't a subset of giving to charity or vice versa. So the things done in my book are two completely different things. And I think this has huge importance in ethics, in debates about right action. So the same kind of mistakes that people make in relation to explanation of action, I think turn debates about when people offer theories of conditions for when an action is right, if they say an action is right if and only if, or sometimes they talk slightly differently in terms of what makes an action right. So if you have these old debates about is it intention or is it consequences, they can't both be true. I think, well, we really need to think about whether action here is a doing or a thing done. I can't see how intention can be relevant to what makes a thing done right, but I can't see how it can't be relevant to the moral assessment of one's doing something. So I think this is something I'm working on now. Really, is looking at why normative ethics really does very little philosophy of action to its own detriment. And I guess again, people have wanted to remain neutral and think, oh, just plug in your favorite account of action. But it doesn't work if we have these different concepts and conceptions.
Mm-hmm. So it's very good that you touched on the topic of ethics. And in particular, I would like to touch on the topic of moral responsibility. So should we take intention into consideration for a wrongdoing?
So continuing with what I was saying before, certainly if we're assessing someone's act of doing something, what we want to know is under which descriptions was the action intentional. And these are going to be the most kind of morally relevant, maybe not the only morally relevant ones, but the most morally relevant. But if on the other hand, you're just trying to figure out what the right thing to do is and whether someone did the right thing, then I don't think intention is really going to come into it typically. There'll be special cases if you want to say the right thing to do is to, I don't know, intentionally do something else, but it gets quite kind of second order. But by and large, if you're trying to figure out what someone should do in this circumstance, or even what a particular person should do in this circumstance, I don't think intention comes in there. And yet, once we have an actor there doing it, whether that action was praiseworthy or blameworthy or permissible, and so on, will, I think, depend on the intention. And I think this way also kind of gives us a distinction relevant to debates about demandingness. So, for example, some people talk of certain moral theories being too demanding, and the question is, well, what do we mean by demanding here? If the answer is that it's too easy to be immoral because this theory makes it sound like you're immoral if you don't do X, Y, and Z, then in separating the doing from the thing done, what we say is, well, no, this theory says you haven't done the right thing if you don't do X, Y, and Z, and that's very important, of course. But there's a separate question about how to evaluate one's failure to do the right thing. And this will be tied to not just intention, but knowledge, availability of knowledge, foresight, what one could have done, what one should have done, our cognitive abilities, our age, our historical and geographical location, and so on. And all these things, by and large, tend to be more important for the assessment of the doing than the thing done. And I think questions of moral responsibility are really tied to the doing, not the thing done, which is why we get all these weird puzzles with moral luck, because people tend to conflate the two. And so we have someone where everything is wrong at the doing level, but they do the right thing, or vice versa. And then these kind of paradoxes of moral luck are meant to come up and be irresolvable, but I think they can be dissolved.
And as you're currently doing research on artificial intelligence, is it possible to make this distinction between the things machines do and the machines doing the things? It seems to me that when it comes to machines, or even some non-human animals, it's difficult or even impossible to separate the action from the machine or the non-human animal performing the action.
That's a very good question. There's a quick, easy answer to it, and then a much harder question relating to it, which I'm still trying to figure out myself, both in terms of animals and AI. But the simple answer is yes, of course, because the distinction is really a very formal one. You mentioned earlier, and I didn't say anything about it. So there's a kind of very basic distinction that's in some ways analogous to a thing believed and a believing, a thing perceived and a perceiving. So in a way, whenever we have a certain kind of verb, we can make this logical, a verb that kind of takes an object, we can take this kind of, make this logical distinction. Now, it doesn't follow from this that the ontology of things on either side of this distinction will run the same. So if there's an eating and a thing eaten, then if a thing eaten is a piece of cake, that's very different from a thing believed, whatever your ontology of things believed are, or of things done. So it's not like on the one hand, we have one kind of thing on the one side and another kind of thing on the other side. Nonetheless, it would be very awkward if this distinction existed with, pretty much everything, thing imagined and imagining, thing said and my saying it, and didn't exist with thing done and a doing. And in that kind of strict, sort of very simple but formal sense, I think there is a distinction between what, say, even my laptop does and it's doing it. and for one, your computer and my computer may both do the same thing or appear to have the same fault. So they may both not do something when you press a particular key, or they may both make a certain kind of noise when overheated. So there are things made, things done, but my computer's doing it in a particular time and place will be different from your computer's doing it in a particular time and place. And certainly if we're looking for kind of mechanical causes, they may or may not have a very similar cause, and that's a separate question. So I think in this kind of very basic sense, AI does things, and there are events and processes of its doing these things, and we can distinguish between the two. I don't know if I persuaded you of this, but the harder question, I think, is that I wanted to tie things done with reasons for action. So I want to say that while there are reasons why things happen, these aren't really reasons for which they happen, unless you buy into a particular kind of teleological metaphysics, which I don't. But we do things for reasons. And if the question is, does AI do things for reasons, in this sense in which this really means acting in light of some consideration, then I think that it's at best misleading to say that it does. And I think this is not an easy question, and we can talk about it more. But if that's what you were sort of thinking of in terms of the distinction, then I think you're right that there's a disanalogy, and it's very important to what happens as decisions are increasingly automated, so that if you have AI making decisions and you have something that doesn't act for reasons making decisions, then we've got to be extremely careful. Animals, I think you're right to bring them in as a way of sort of trying to think about these things. I think some animals do act for reasons, but that's another question.
I agree with you, except the fact that machines or some animals do not have intentions or mental states in the same way as humans do. So on the distinction between things machines do and the machines doing of those things, you said that this distinction can't be made because when your laptop and my laptop do something, they might do so for very different reasons. And this is true, we can make the distinction, but I think what we mean when we say that our laptops did the same thing for two different reasons. When we say reasons, we do not mean this in the same way as we mean it when we say that humans did something for such and such reasons. When in the people's doing the things, we attribute intention, we attribute some mental states, we attribute some motivation, some beliefs, some desires. And it seems to me all these attributes, beliefs, desires, motivation, inner mental states are absent in machines, in artificial intelligence. So I'm not exactly sure what is the doing.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I think I agree with a lot of what you said, actually, if not quite the letter of some of the things towards the end. But so I think you're right in the most important thing here, which is that I don't think machines act for reasons. At least it seems to me we haven't yet found a sense in which this wouldn't be misleading to say that they act for reasons. I'm sort of open-minded about this, but it seems to me that there are reasons why machines do things, and your machine and my machine may do the same thing, and there may be different reasons why they do these things. And you're quite right, we may, in kind of ordinary language, easily slip to talk of a reason for, but this doesn't mean something like a consideration the machine is responding to. So there are causes, and I think you're right that right now it's hard to attribute intentions in relation to this, to to machines. I think belief and desire is a little bit trickier. I mean, I don't think of any of these things as mental states in the case of humans anyway, and certainly computers have states, though they're not mental states as I understand them. But I do think, and I've changed my mind on this, I do think it's perfectly fine and indeed helpful to talk of certain kinds of machines as thinking and wanting and reasoning, and of course calculating. And I think of course we can have a kind of more refined notion of what it is to think and what thinking requires, and does it require consciousness, and so on and so forth. But I think Turing got it right in his the paper famous for the Turing Test, where he says almost by the by at the start that, look, this question about whether computers can think or not is a kind of pointless one that's not for philosophers to answer, because the language will just change. We will just start talking in this way. And I think there's a kind of very innocuous sense in which you might say my computer it's trying to shut down. It thinks there's a USB stick still in there. It wants to do that. And I think as long as we don't get carried away by that language to think that it's doing necessarily the same kind of thing that we're doing when we have beliefs and desires, I think it can be helpful. And it can be helpful because there is this weak sense in which machines can understand and misunderstand, can know or not know things, and can reason. There are sort of patterns of reasoning. And I think it's important that we call it reasoning, not because I think they're doing what humans do when we reason, but because if you're trying to explain automated decisions, what you really are trying to figure out is why the AI behaved as it did. And there's this kind of standard, but I think mistaken assumption that really you just need to find the code or the program or the algorithm that will kind of explain this. But in fact, in many cases, if not most cases, you don't need to do that at all. What you need to find out is how the machine is reasoning, and that can be done counterfactually, for example. So if I'm putting something in a search engine and I want to know why the results come out as they did and in the order they did, what I'm trying to figure out, for example, is whether the machine is more interested in how many people have previously inputted this thing and which sites they tend to hit, or whether it's influenced by some kind of advertising that's putting something higher up than something else, or whether it's finding the closest match for the string of words I put in, or whatever. And I think it's innocuous to talk of these things as different ways of reasoning. And I sense that maybe we disagree on this. I don't know.
On some aspects, I think yes, that we have come to sort of an agreement. In some other issues, I feel. Before moving on to Wittgenstein, I would like to touch a bit on the metaphysics of the philosophy of action, and in particular whether you think there are any necessary actions. I tie this to the question of origins in metaphysics, in whether anything necessarily has the origins it has. So, for example, if I had to come from my parents and I couldn't have come from other parents, then the fact that I exist in a possible world, which happens to be this world, means that my parents are necessary beings, that they are the necessary cause of my existence. But if there are no necessary entities, then there are no necessary causes either, and maybe no necessary actions. Is this clear?
So I don't work on questions of necessity in relation to beings and so on. That may be, I mean, that may be partly for Wittgensteinian reasons. So maybe this is acting as a nice bridge to the next part of the discussion. But could you say a little bit more about how you understand a necessary action? Is this an action that had to take place?
Yes. So given the current state of affairs in the world.
Yes, I see. Okay. So
just to repeat the example, if I couldn't have come from different parents, then the fact that I exist makes my parents necessary beings in this world. I'm thinking if the same thinking could be applied for actions.
Yes, I think I've understood now. There are so many sort of different ways to try and enter this question, but maybe the easiest is to sort of lay my cards on the table, and you can then maybe ask if you want me to defend any particular one of them. So I'm a kind of what's sometimes called libertarian compatibilist. So I think that while it's incredibly there's a lot of luck involved. In terms of at any given point, what I'm going to do is in some ways predetermined by a huge number of things. But I think that in many cases these things don't necessitate action. They just make it far more likely that I will perform a certain kind of act than another. What they may also necessitate is the things I see as reasons for acting and the options I see before me when there are probably many more that aren't alive to me. So there's a whole lot of stuff that's necessitated and not up to me. But nonetheless, in the kind of paradigmatic case of action performed for reasons as opposed to more automatic kinds of behavior, I think that I guess I leave quite a lot of space for the agent there. I'm undecided as to whether agent causation is the right way to talk about these things. I prefer to think of agents as truth makers. So the thought is that I can make it true that certain events, including bodily movements of mine, take place, and I make this true either in acting or by acting. And then there's a sort of separate question about causation. So this is not so much by way of argument, but to kind of lay my cards on the table. I called myself a compatibilist because none of this is originating for me with worries to do with free will or anything like that. And I think that there will be occasions where an action will be completely necessitated. In a sense, the faster an action is a reaction to something, the more likely it is that it was just triggered by something. So you shout Constantine on the street and I turn my head. That to me seems to be a nice case of a necessary action. It's been necessitated by your shouting my name, and I can get, if someone asks me why did you turn your head, I can say because I heard my name. So I can render the action intelligible. We can even call that a case of giving a reason for an action. But these kinds of actions will be necessitated, but I'm not sure all actions are of this kind. But I've sort of said a lot of different things because I wasn't quite sure what you were interested in.
It's I want to touch on the last thing you said. Someone calling your name on the street and you turning your head. But in this scenario, it's the case that you could have turned your head without someone calling your name.
That's right. So I could have turned my head for some other reason, and I may also be the kind of person that doesn't turn their head when they hear their name. Or maybe it will depend, maybe if I'm in Greece, I don't do it because so many people have that name that that I wouldn't necessarily think it was me, but in another location, I am in Hertfordshire, I'm more likely to turn my head. So there are all sorts of things that are out of our control that will explain why it is that I turn my head in one case and not another, and they will have to do with upbringing, with language learning, and so on. Fred Dretske has a very nice distinction, which I think unfortunately his view didn't become as popular as Davidson's at the time, but he distinguishes between triggering, what he calls triggering and structuring causes of an action. So what triggers my turning my head is that you made a bunch of noises. But why did your making these noises cause me to turn my head? Well, it's because of their semantic content, for lack of a better term. I'm not sure I believe in semantic content in the way Dretske does. But the point is that it's because I recognize Constantine as something that's my name, or maybe if you shout "watch out" or something, and I jump, those same noises won't cause my unless you shout it really loudly, they won't cause my cat to jump, and certainly not for the same reason. So we have a kind of structural explanation and a sort of triggering cause, and the structuring cause tells you why the triggering cause triggered the event as it did. And it may well be that in these cases, there's necessity all the way down, both with triggering and with structuring. But like I said, I think this works better for, Dretske thought this worked for everything. I think this works better for these kind of actions like head turning than for cases where we reason a lot in advance before making a decision.
Mm-hmm. Professor Sandis, I would really like to thank you for your participation in the podcast.
My pleasure. Thank you.
All the best. Thanks a lot.
Thanks very much. Thank you.
You have just listened to Premise Podcast. Subscribe to Premise Podcast on YouTube and make sure to follow the podcast on Twitter and Facebook. The podcast is also available on Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Soundcloud, Stitcher, and Spotify. Please consider supporting Premise Podcast on Patreon to help bring philosophy to the public. See you next week. Thanks for listening.